Dr. Barry Guitar, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you. So probably you need no introduction for the vast majority of people in the stuttering world, but just in case there's a few folks out there that have not heard about you or know your backstory, I'll share your bio here a little bit. So you had grown up mainly in Connecticut with stints in Brooklyn and Charleston, South Carolina. Your father was in the Navy, so you guys were a military family, which obviously creates some moving a lot of times. You had gotten your PhD in speech language pathology from the University of Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
You've been a professor emeritus forever until a few years ago when you retired at the University of Vermont. Obviously, there in the great state of Vermont. You still live in Vermont now. Looks like you have a cabin. I heard you live on a lake up there, so not a bad life.
Yeah, so we kind of shuttle back and forth. Well, as of last year, we started going to Lexington, Virginia in the wintertime. So that was our first winter, and now we're going to be here in the summers, there in the winters.
Gotcha. Not a bad way to do it. Those winters can get pretty chilly up there, I know.
Yeah.
So you're the author of a textbook in stuttering named Stuttering, Its Nature and Treatment, which I think has been used at many, well, I know it's been used in many SLP grad programs around the country and around the world for that matter, and was recently translated into maybe Korean or Japanese, one of those languages over there. Sorry, one of my 4 kids banging on the door there.
That's great.
So another interesting thing that you had done was you had gotten speech therapy when you were at Western Michigan University under the great Charles Van Riper, who's a legend, obviously, in the speech therapies stuttering history, and sort of laid the groundwork for a lot of things. Can you kind of describe your experience getting therapy under Mr. Van Riper?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm writing this biography, I'm really getting back in touch with him, if you will. And so the experience was challenging, let's say. I mean, there was at least one of the group who dropped out besides me. And I only dropped out after I'd been there several months and had so much fluency. I thought, is this going to last? And I dropped out to sort of travel around the world and test it out. But the very beginning, Van Riper just really challenged us. And I remember after the first day, he said, okay, before you come in tomorrow, go up to 10 people you've never seen before. Just pick them out on the sidewalk and pretend you do know them by saying, hi, Joe, how are you? I haven't seen you for a long time. So this was not exactly due to stuttering, but it's just to do with, would we have fear of, confronting somebody with this made up story that we know them? And it was hard at first, but by the time I got to the 10th one, I went up to a woman and I said, hi, Joe, how you doing? I haven't seen you in a long time. And she was a bit surprised, but, she said, I don't think I know you. And then moved along. But I think there was just, a lot of challenge to overcome your fear. So, like going into stores and, you'd be wanting to ask the clerk for something. And instead of just starting and talking, you had a piece of paper and you'd write the sentence down. Like, I am looking for some marijuana or whatever you're looking for. And you would write it and the clerk would just stand there staring at like, what the heck's going on here? And then only after you would write it would you say it. And then, he said, well, how many pounds do you want or whatever? And then you write the answer. And so it made you really resist time pressure. It made you really put yourself out there. And so many of the assignments were about, how do you say this, but becoming braver, just pushing yourself to become braver. And then, of course, eventually we started working on our speech. And so this combination of working on our tendency to avoid, our tendency to hide the stuttering, those sorts of things, and then actually changing the stuttering. And so with Van Riper, as you probably know, the main things you'd work on are just staying in the stutter, making sure that if you stutter with a lot of pressure at the end, like Barry, you just have a pause, again, resisting time pressure, and then say it again, but not fluently, but just a little more easily, like Barry, and doing things like that. And then making sure, a lot of this that Van Riper taught is stuff that I deeply believe in, which is that yes, you have some inherited thing. Your brain is a bit different, but that's not the real, important thing with stuttering. What's important is the learning you've done. And so as you were a child and you're going like this, you started to put pressure on it. You'd squeeze, this is not a thing that you really did consciously. It would just happen because you're, panicked, you're trying to get out of it. And so you'd say Barry like that. And you had to learn to go Barry and end it slowly and loosely. And then after that, you'd learn to sort of start it slowly and loosely, like Barry. But for me, not only at that time, but continuing in the many, many years after that, it's a matter of staying in the moment of stuttering and decreasing your fear. So we had a mix of group therapy, which was good. Van Riper was at the head of the table, and he'd say, Barry, did you, what were your, successes like yesterday, and what couldn't you do? And we'd share it, and then, everybody would talk about theirs. And so there's a lot of support because we all stuttered, some of us more severely than others. And, that sort of being in a group, all of whom stuttered, was Van Riper, who also stuttered, but very mildly. That was quite effective. And what's been interesting as I've worked on the bio, I've tried to be in touch with all of the other members of the group and see what's been going on with them. And that's been a real revelation and quite eye-opening. So that'll be fun to put it in those things in the book. But shall I say any more about Van Riper? Do you want me to talk about having dropped out?
Well, let's definitely talk more for sure about Van Riper, and yes, let's get to that part when you dropped out. But with the group therapy, because that's something that, as I was telling you earlier, I wish that had stuck around more by the time I came along. So I was, born in 1977, so I was getting a lot of speech therapy in the early to late 80s as a kid, and then through the 90s as well. And so the type of therapy that I always had done was just me alone with one therapist. And it really didn't fight that. Well, a lot of the value, I think, of the group approach, group therapy, or, group coaching, whatever you want to call it, is you're fighting that sense of isolation. That you're the only person in the world that has this, because most of us, you just go through life and you don't really meet anybody else that stutters. And you really think that you're the only one. Maybe you read a book and it says you're not, but as far as you are concerned, you are. So nobody else, you feel like nobody else understands what you're going through, and you don't get a chance to just meet other people and realize, hey, people that stutter are cool too. Like, just because I stutter,
well said,
just because I stutter doesn't make me sort of subhuman, which is how I felt as a kid. Like, I wasn't fully me.
Ouch.
Like I was a shadow of who I would be. That's how I felt as a kid. And I knew I had all these things to say, and I thought they were worth hearing, but I didn't think it was okay to stutter, and if it wasn't going to come out right, and this is starting in maybe the 6th or 7th grade when I
Mhm. Yeah,
am aware of it. And I
you're
started
really sensitive at that age. Yeah.
right. And I started trying so hard not to stutter, which is, and when you're trying, I really like the analogies to sports, right? It's almost like a catcher in baseball. There have been cases where the catcher struggles to throw the ball back to the pitcher, right? He can throw people out at second base, but
Mm.
he starts, he maybe overthrows the pitcher a couple times just in throwing it back, and all of a sudden he's trying so hard not to
Yeah.
mess up that
Yeah.
it's hard not to mess up at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little maybe also analogous to being in the batter's box and you see this ball coming at you, and especially if you've been hit, is the instinct to pull back, and that just wrecks the whole thing for you.
Mm. Right. Then you're playing scared. You're
Mm-hmm.
not fearless, right? And no athlete can be at their best unless they're playing fearless out there. I mean, you have to play smart also. You
Yeah.
can't play too reckless or you're not going to be good either. But
Mm.
and I think there's a lot of athletes over the course of history that were great when the bright lights were not on them.
Mm-hmm.
And when they get out there with 10,000 people watching and the cameras rolling and all that, it's a different story.
Mm-hmm.
And and yeah, so I think that performance anxiety, really, I think there's a lot of there's a deep analogy there. I think that is very similar to the experience for a lot of us that stutter.
Yeah, I think you really hit it on the head when you said about the catcher trying real hard, trying extra hard to throw the ball right, and that just messes up his coordination or her coordination.
Mm. Yeah, another analogy is when you're hitting a golf ball. When you're playing golf,
Mm-hmm.
when there's a pond in between you and the green,
Yes.
and a lot of times mess with you.
Yeah.
If the pond's not there, you'll hit it plenty high.
Yeah.
Pond's there, you're standing over it like, man, I hope I don't hit this in the water.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you mentioned the example of going back and saying it over. So you're out talking to people with the assignment given to you by Van Riper that if you struggled through your name, go back and say it again immediately, I assume.
After a pause. So you kind of punish yourself. So if you went Barry, you ended up squeezing your face and blasting out with it. And you need to punish that. And so you go, Barry, so that those few seconds where you're saying nothing effect is a little bit of punishment of what you did just before. And so you're less likely to do that in the future.
Mm. Well, do you think there's also an aspect there of rather than just moving on and psychologically knowing, man, I just really struggled on my name, and then thinking, God, I wonder what's going to happen the next time I have to say my name or whatever the word may be.
Yeah.
Although our name oftentimes is, that's an almost universal thing for the vast majority of people.
Yeah.
Challenging, right? That we're also just getting a win before we move on. So we're I like this analogy, one that sort of resonates with me, and you can already tell I like analogies in general, but kind of like you're hiking in the woods and a wolf jumps out and bites you, rather than just scampering off as fast as you can, grateful that it wasn't worse, but worrying about, well, when's he going to jump out and get me again? Pause, turn around at the wolf, look him in the eye, and, I mean, it's kind of a violent analogy, but pull out your sharpened knife and stick in his heart before you move on, so that he knows you won that skirmish. You won that skirmish. And sticking with that sort of stuttering wolf, as I like to call it, analogy, stuttering can be like a wild animal living out there in the woods behind the house, scary, mysterious, comes and goes as he pleases and wreaks havoc, and oftentimes comes at the worst times when we want not to stutter, right? When you're talking to your boss or job interview or trying to
Girlfriend,
impress
yeah.
somebody, right? And so taming that wild animal, not that we're going to kill him, not that we're ever going to be cured and we're never going to have a stuttering wolf, but making him, kind of calling him out into the open
Mm-hmm.
so that we can see
Yeah.
it and sort of taming him, domesticating him to some extent, rather than him being just untamed and wild in the woods out back.
Yep, yep. At least making friends. And I think a lot of people can relate that to just a neighborhood dog who, barks and sort of makes you feel intimidated. With a neighborhood dog, you're often able to look him in the eye and approach him in a sort of a neutral way and make friends with him or her. And so it's similar to what you do with stuttering. And I think you said maybe in an email that being able to look at people was a big change for you. And so it's sort of confronting. I mean, it's not confronting with anger, just like I'm okay as I am. And so as you look at the person, it's like you're looking at this dog who has threatened you. And then once you start looking at the dog in the eye, the dog realizes you're not going to run. And so the stutter realizes you're not going to run also.
Yeah, that eye contact thing was a game changer for me when I was brought around my freshman year at Florida State. A guy named Dr. Richard Ham that ran the SLP program there.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't even start with any technique. He just brought me around campus, made me look people in the eye, made me get used to stuttering when I was looking at them. And I realized for the first time then that the vast majority of people would pretty quickly figure out, okay, this guy's got some kind of speech impediment, and they would just sit there and listen respectfully and answer my question like I was a normal person. And that just came as a revelation to me. I thought people were going to laugh and say, what, you're a joke and walk off and all that. And, maybe 1 in 1,000 people would do that, but it's not the kind of person you want to be around anyway. So it's a good way to filter out the jerks, I suppose. But very few people would do that. And, I found that it made them more comfortable too when I would look them in the eye, because when I was looking over here, blocking, stuttering can look very uncomfortable to people, right? They don't know what's going on, and you look tense. You are physically tense a lot of times. So if we look really uncomfortable, it can make other people feel more uncomfortable. And then it's kind of a vicious cycle of uncomfortableness in the conversation. Whereas if you're looking them in the eye,
and maintaining a pretty relaxed posture, like you're comfortable.
Right.
Then they get comfortable. And you see that they're comfortable, and it keeps you from tensing up.
Right. So it becomes a virtuous circle rather than a vicious cycle, rather than the opposite. And and it's like you were saying, it's making us face that thing that we're really afraid of, which is judgment, which is people thinking that we're, whatever, that we're stupid, that we lack confidence, or just that we're subpar in some way. When we're looking at people, we're facing that judgment, and that gives us strength and, shows confidence and courage and all that kind of stuff. And people, it can be reversed, where people, not that stuttering is ideally how we would choose to talk, but it can be a way of connecting with people in a way where our courage and our character is on display. More so than just a regular sort of meaningless small talk. Hey, how you doing? Good. How you doing? Okay, blah, blah, blah. And then you walk off and there's no real meaning there. You can actually be like, oh, this guy, really wants to say what he's trying to say, because he's battling through it and he's hanging right in there and finishing his sentence,
Yeah, it's like that. Did you see that 13-year-old on the Democratic National Convention? And he seemed like he really was comfortable. I mean, he'd have some big blocks like that. And once the word came out, he looked like he was okay with himself and, happy to talk. And so that's that's a nice portrayal that I think relaxes people.
Absolutely, absolutely. So so eye contact has been a big part of your approach, both with your own speech and with the textbook and providing therapy for people and teaching.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it often takes a while for. I mean, it sure It took me a while as a client of Ben Riper's, and even afterwards to sort of make that keep doing it, because there is that tendency to pull back and look away. But yeah, and I think anytime. I mean, it's part of confronting fear, and like when you think about it, I think I've written about this probably in animals. The dominant animal in a pack will use eye contact to assert their dominance. And so I think there's something in eye contact that affects how you feel about yourself in terms of your, what's the word I want there? Your comfort, your confidence. Yeah, I guess confidence is probably the best word. And so there's just something in animal brains and people's brains and everything else that clicks when you have good eye contact. So millions of things going on, and so I'm glad that Dr. Ham got you going into that.
Well, and that's a great point with animals because assuming that evolution is the way that we all got here, that means eye contact goes back before our species was even here, right?
Sure.
And
Yep.
and in our species, obviously we don't know about early human times because we weren't writing anything down back then. Say 200,000 years ago, whenever we became our modern species. But presumably, eye contact must have been there even before language was there, right? Even before talking was there. And so it is just like it's baked into our DNA in some deep way. Uh, and and it's amazing. There were many times, I'm sure perhaps you've experienced this too, when, like you said, you feel that tendency, you feel a block maybe coming. So you think you're about to stutter. Maybe you're in a group of new people and you're like, I don't want to deal with the judgment. Maybe I just won't say this, or I'll
Mm-hmm.
say it, but then sort of look away sheepishly. But when you make yourself look at people, it's like the action leads the thinking or leads the psychology, right? So you do that, and then before you know it, your courage has grown and you've risen to the challenge of that moment.
Yeah, and that continues throughout your life. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this. Like yesterday, I met some new people. There were a group of us, and I asked, I think, a young lady what was her relationship to this other person who turned out to be her stepmother. But I knew I'd probably get stuck, but I went right into it without avoidance and without anything else. And so sometimes when you go right into it, the stutter sort of vanishes. It's like a dog that you think might attack you or something if you go toward it. And so it must have sounded like, what is the relationship between you two? And so I sometimes I never know if some of those easy stutters are ones I put in that wouldn't have been stuttered, or they're real stutters that almost unconsciously I changed to being looser.
I
But
hear
here it is.
it.
I mean, more than 50 years after my therapy, I'm still needing to kind of push myself sometimes, looking for opportunities. I mean, I'm always looking for opportunities to introduce myself because, as you said, saying your own name can be a difficult one. And so the other day, this guy was walking along the road. I was out in my garden, and he said, "I think I know you," or something like that. I said, "Yes, I'm Barry Guitar." And so quickly, I got right into that B because that's given me trouble all my life. But it's something that I look for opportunities to do, and it just keeps me on my toes, keeps me comfortable, keeps me fluent.
Mm.
Or can I take that back? I'm not saying it keeps me fluent because I don't think there's any great wonderfulness about being fluent, but it keeps me comfortable and making my stutters comfortable to me and the listener.
Mm. it's really kind of a paradox, right? If you focus too much on fluency, if we're
Mhm,
chasing fluency too much, if the
mhm,
stuttering mind, if you will,
mhm,
chasing fluency, then it's almost like chasing perfection, like an athlete. I mean, yes, you want to get better and better, but that not being afraid to make a mistake.
mhm,
Um, so by kind of saying, look, the most important thing here is that if I want to ask a question, if I want to find out what this person's relationship is to this person, ask the question. That's the most
mhm,
important thing, is to find out, you know,
mhm,
what I want to find out and not run away from it. And it really is powerful, right? It's almost like, I haven't delved deep into this science, but I feel like it's almost, the stuttering is perpetuated in a lot of ways by the fear,
mhm,
almost like a phobia. So, and my understanding is if you're terrified of heights, for example, well, you can spend hours and hours and hours on a psychologist's couch talking about how, well, it's not rational because airplanes are safer than cars, and I shouldn't be scared on the top of the Empire State Building because there's big giant fences, and
mhm,
likelihood of anything happening is so low. Um, but spending all that time on the psychologist's couch isn't necessarily going to get you over that fear. It's going to heights over and over and
mhm,
over again until your brain eventually realizes, look, my fear here is kind of unfounded. And, you know, with something like heights, I mean, you know, obviously heights can be dangerous if you're in an unsafe situation, of course. If you fall off the Empire State Building, you will die. Whereas a speech block has never actually killed anybody, as far as I know. And but it can be. I mean, we all know, almost every person that stutters can tell you it can be the scariest. I mean, scariest moment probably I've ever had is when I got dropped off at college at Florida State, still completely in my shell, socially, not knowing anybody. I've never
mhm,
been that scared of anything in my life, and
mhm, mhm,
that's a time usually when kids are excited, and that's a great moment in their life. Going to
mhm.
college to have some fun for 4 years and hopefully get a degree. Um, but yeah, so that attack and the fear thing. So it sounds like Van Riper was pretty central to what he was doing, and pretty central to your approach as well.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think you had sort of mentioned that you might be curious about what I think about the past and the future of stuttering therapy. And I think that's one of the things that is, whether you're dealing with a fear or not. Um, and historically, when you look back in the 1900s, when Van Riper, was a teenager, maybe early 20s even, he had therapy that was don't stutter. It was a place called the Bogue School. And I don't know if that was a school, but some of these places would have you swing your arms or talk in a way that kept you from stuttering. And, that was the main thing, don't stutter. So you never dealt with a fear. Well, so then, you go up to the 1940s and 50s, then people like Van Riper and other people began to realize how important confronting the fear was. And that was sort of like, a main thing. But then back in then move forward to the 60s and 70s, there are the operant conditioning folks, who'd worked with other things and didn't worry about emotions, just, change the behavior. And I mean, I worked in Australia for a couple of years, and our focus was not on dealing with a fear, but just on modifying. So we'd start them out like this, they'd be fluent, we get them a little faster. And it was a token economy. They needed to earn tokens by progressing. And if they didn't get tokens, they couldn't eat, because our program was set up like you had to use your tokens to eat. And so people would, not get over the fear, and then they'd think they were fluent and they'd be dismissed from the program. And then 2 weeks later or a month later or whatever, the fear would be so strong that the old stuttering would come back and they'd feel worse than ever. And so I sort of feel like currently one of the nice changes that's happened is people who stutter are very much like, I stutter, so what? And they're willing to just go ahead and let the stuttering out and work on their confidence and other things. I mean, I think a lot of times people do that and they don't necessarily work on modifying the moment of stuttering. So it's just, it's almost like too much just focusing on the fear, maybe not enough also focusing on how to modify. Because when I think about my fear, some of those confrontational things that Van Riper taught me, like looking people in the eye and, saying what I wanted to say, that was good. But the other component for me was learning to stay in the stutter until I loosened it and having the end of the stutter be loose. So once I started doing that, then I had a tool I could use that was going to be useful to me in making me feel like my speech was under control. That worked backward on the fear, and the fear went down and easier to modify. And so for me, those two things are key things. That is working on the sort of like emotional, psychological part, and then working on the behavioral part, both at similar. I mean, both simultaneously and whatever.
That makes sense. So in other words, get beyond the fear and the avoidance and the, holding back on being yourself and saying what you want to say, but also having some sort of modification. I don't know if modification technique is the right word, but
Well, I think it is. Yeah, that's a good phrase.
yeah, something where, uh, yeah. So it's a technique. So you have something, if you will, to go to, not just say it, because and from a quality of life standpoint, in most cases, just getting over the fear and avoidance is going to improve your quality of life a lot. Right? Where you're not walking around every second of every day worried about who you're going to have to talk to next, and well, what does this person think and that person think?
Yeah.
And that's a lot of the mental hell of it. But it certainly is nice to, rather than having a 20-second block, have a 1-second block that doesn't have as much struggle and force, because just purely physical, even taking away all the psychological, mental, tough aspect of stuttering, just the physical, just pushing, and the way I used to do it was a lot of, I call it lifting weights with my face, where I just kind of hold my breath and just force that word out. I mean, that was tiring. Like I remember maybe 7 years ago, before my grandfather died, because he had fought in World War II in Korea and, lived through a lot of very interesting times in the 20th century and was a really awesome guy himself. So I did like 4 hours of oral history stuff with him where I recorded it. And he was 94 years old, but he didn't have a stutter, and he could sit there and chat all day, no problem. And I was 36 and just exhausted from talking for 4 hours.
Yeah.
So much breath holding, and speeches, as you know well, it's not supposed to be a super effortful process, but when you're battling through syllables, it can be very, very tiring. So it's definitely, your point is, I agree 100% that it's not just on the fear psychological side, but it's also physical. And it certainly is nice to have something to go to, something to focus on, some way to navigate this in a skilled way. And, obviously to each his own or her own. If somebody doesn't want that, then, they're free to stutter as much as they want. It's not a crime, and we're free to say whatever we want either way. But, most of us would rather struggle less, I would say. And it can be challenging. For some people, just the psychological is enough. Once they get beyond that, and maybe they're more mild, I don't know, or they become more mild so that it's not an issue, and so for some people that might be enough, but for a lot of us, you need that physical technique also. And so I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
So with Van Riper, you had mentioned that you had left the program after a few months because you kind of wanted to take this show on the road. You had this newfound speaking confidence, and we'll call it control, maybe not fluency, and you wanted to travel the world and see how it held up.
Yeah, so I really had jackrabbits in my boots, if you will. And but yet, and the environment with Van Riper, it was, you just felt like I can stutter and it's all going to be fine. Well, when I hitchhiked out of town, the first car I got into, I had a stutter. And so I was a little bit surprised because I'd been so, my stuttering had been so in control. And, but, as I traveled around, I sort of, it was, getting back under my control. But as I said to you earlier, I was traveling through West Africa, and I felt like, well, I could go back and I need a little more therapy. And so that's when I wrote to Van Riper and I said, can I come back for a little more therapy? And he said, he scrawled on the bottom of my letter, yes, if you'll let me help you. Because I was sort of like a bit resistant to therapy and feeling like I can do it and that kind of stuff. So when I went back, it was more individual therapy. But I hooked up with friends I'd been in therapy with before and other people who stuttered around the clinic, and so that was a bit of group support. But a lot of it was just Van Riper and me taking on jobs. Like I was a Fuller brush salesman for a while, and that you had to knock on these strangers' doors and try to sell them something, and so that was a nice challenge. And then being able to sort of check in with Van Riper every once in a while was helpful. So that's that was a good sort of what I want, follow-up therapy, I guess you'd say.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And so as you alluded to earlier, so you're now working on a biography of Van Riper, and and he was obviously a person that stuttered also. Uh, I think I remember him, or maybe reading something that he had written saying that he was fairly severe as a kid, but then I'm not sure how he was by the time that you were working with him. Um,
Yeah, I mean, you could see that he had stutters, but they were, pretty comfortable stutters, sort of like some of the ones that I have. Um, but he had been very severe as a child. He grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. His father was a country physician, and I think his father felt bad that his son stuttered, and here this physician couldn't help his own son. I think it made the father feel embarrassed about having a son who stuttered, and so his father was very hard on him. And he went to some of these crazy schools that say don't stutter and just do this and do the other thing. And then he ran into somebody who stuttered more easily, and he suddenly began to realize that he shouldn't be aiming for fluency. He should be aiming for stutter more easily. And then he ended up working with a guy named Bringleson, who was, quite, I think, charismatic and able to, help him confront his fears and change his stuttering. And then Bringleson went down to University of Iowa to work on his PhD, and Van Riper kind of followed him. And that was the center of the new stuttering therapy. Lee Edward Travis, Wendell Johnson. It was just like a hot center for new discoveries and stuttering and stuff like that. But I don't think Travis was much of a therapist, and Van Riper was so intrigued by the idea of learning to stutter easily that he would help out, with groups. I mean, he would be in a group therapy, and then he would like take over the leadership. And I think the head of that whole, unit, Lee Edward Travis, recognized Van Riper's, insights and gifts in stuttering therapy, and so he really encouraged that. And then when Van Riper decided to go, he got his PhD, then he went off to get a job teaching, and he went to Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And it was at that point that he began to really experiment with different ways of doing his individual and group therapy. So there's a wonderful chapter in a 1958 book edited by John Eisenson, and the chapter is called Experiments in Stuttering Therapy. And so in that chapter, Van Riper details all the things he tried and what things worked and what things didn't work with his, individual therapy and group therapy. I think Van Riper was not as, what's the word I want, was not as intrigued with working with children. I mean, he did some, and I think he was probably very successful, but I've been lucky because in my work as a professor, I've been able to work with adults and children as well as teach and do research. And so oddly enough, one of the sort of funny quirks of my career is that because I had those 2 years in Australia, I had, you know, a number of connections in Australia, and the Australians back in the, when was it, the 70s, 80s, let's say 80s and 90s, developed a just be fluent kind of approach, the one that I've been sort of denigrating, but they used it with like kids age 2, 3, 4, 5. And it was like rewarding the kids for their fluency and being sort of open, like, oh, you had a little, you know, bump there. Could you say that one again? Now, this is the sort of thing that normally I would have said, no, that's ridiculous. You know, you're just trying to, you know, teach people to be fluent, and that's the thing. Well, when you're working with a kid that young, 3 years old, I found that you can get the stuttering taken care of fairly effectively because you have the parents as therapists and they're working with the kiddo 7 days a week. It's hard on the parents, just it is nowadays, all this remote learning, the parents have to be there for the kid. And so we had the parents doing the therapy, you know, and learning to do it and coming in and working with us to become better therapists for their kids. And so many of those kids I worked with, the parents will say to me, Barry, thank you so much for giving me my child back. Because, you know, here was a child who was fluent until age 2 or 3, whatever, suddenly started to stutter, and it was a different child. They felt like they'd lost their child. And then they'd have some of this therapy. The kid would become completely fluent. And as I followed up on those kids, you know, 5 and 10 years later, so many of them never remembered having stuttered. And so it was, the therapy was an okay experience. Other times, for some kids who are, you know, who are very sensitive kids, you need a different kind of therapy, like an openness about stuttering and stuff like that. But yeah, I sort of feel like a little luckier than Van Riper that I had the whole age range to spend a lot of time working with. So that was a fake stutter, but I just like to put them in to keep myself honest, if you will. But in any case, yeah. So it's been fascinating to me to see, you know, what works for some people, because I had a couple of clients who, I had this one woman, an adult. So usually I would use, you know, like overcome your fear and that kind of stuff. I would not typically use talk this way and be fluent. But anyway, this woman was quite, I don't know, comfortable in the world. She was the only woman in the Vermont Highway Department. She was designing roads and stuff like that. When she'd come to therapy, she'd drive a motorcycle. And we worked with her with what's called prolonged speech, which is what I'd also used in Australia. And so we started her off the first day of Thursday talking like this. So she was completely fluent. And then through Thursday and then Friday, we sped her up a little by little. And so on Friday afternoon, I said to her, Linda, when you come back on Monday, your stuttering will probably be back. And so we'll have to work with the fear and other things like that. Well, she came back Monday completely fluent. And so I was like, you know, a bit puzzled. And so, you know, she's, after, you know, a couple more days, she said, you know, I can do this myself or whatever. I mean, she really wasn't having to do anything. She was just fluent. And so I followed her for years and years. And as a matter of fact, last summer, so that must have been like at least 30 years since I'd first worked with her. I found her, you know how you track people down on the internet. And so I tracked her down. She was living in Colorado. She'd been married. But she was coming back to Vermont to visit her family. I said, well, let's get together for lunch. So we got together for lunch and I actually recorded her. She's still almost completely fluent. Stuttering has never gotten her way again. And so I was asking her about, you know, the onset of her stuttering, which for some reason she didn't talk about prior to that. And she was talking about a traumatic incident when she was about 5 years old, and that set the stuttering off, and it just took off. And so there are, one of my point is that there are some people who are adults who, for some reason, they don't have that much fear. And as long as you give them a means to get more fluent, that may be all they need. But those are rare, and I don't really sort of advocate that as a major therapy. I mean, I think the thing that prompted me to get hold of this Linda 30 years afterwards, I had a new client a couple of years ago. It was a man who's very successful restaurateur. And he, got hold of me and said, my stuttering is getting in the way and stuff. And so I had him come in. When I teach, I have people who stutter come in on one of the teaching days, and I usually have 4 or 5 or so, and I break the students into groups of 2 and 3, and they work with these individuals. And one of the individuals had started stuttering suddenly. He'd been in a he'd been with his father on a sailfish that had flipped over. He was trapped in the sail and almost drowned. And that incident set off stuttering that he didn't have before. And he was 9. And so as the group of students worked with him and talked about that experience, and then, taught him some ways to change his behavior, he became very fluent. And so there are some adults who you can use an approach that doesn't focus on the fear, that just changes the behavior, and that may be all they need. And in some cases, you can do it very, very quickly, relatively quickly. Whereas most of us, like you and me, it needs a while, needs a year or something of work to really get fluent. But
yeah, in my case, so it was, so first I overcame the fear. And is that kind of what you're driving at here? That if somebody comes in and they don't have all the, they essentially don't have the iceberg. I don't know if you like Sheehan's analogy, but that they've got the 10% or whatever of the stuttering, which is visible above the surface, but they don't have all the shame and embarrassment and fear and, sense of inferiority and performance anxiety and all that kind of stuff. They just have a stutter, kind of like somebody might have a limp or something when they walk. They don't feel bad about their limp. They wish they didn't have it, but it's not making them feel like a, substandard person or anything.
Right.
And in that case, if they don't have that 90% of the iceberg below, well, then you can just focus on the 10% above. The analogy, kind of that I like to use there is, think of a real iceberg in the ocean. If you melt the 90% below the surface, that 10% above is going to have a much tougher time staying above.
Yeah.
And so in my case, I had really reversed the psychology of stuttering for me, and it came within 3 months or so of that freshman year of college when I learned to look people in the eye. And I kind of flipped it in my head where it was making me feel inferior before that. And I started thinking, well, this is how I talk. And if you have a problem with it, go hang out with somebody else. And don't let the door hit you on the rear end as you leave. Like, not that I had to say that to people, but that's how I thought about it, right? So in other words, if you have a problem with my stutter, well, that's not a reflection of my character. It's a reflection of your character. And so I went pretty quickly to where I would like raise my hand in class at Florida State with 150 people in a crowded lecture hall and ask questions and stutter away. And I'd look around as I'm stuttering from person to person and look at the professor, like actually challenging people. Not, like I said, not that I was saying, I wasn't verbally challenging them, like saying it, but essentially challenging them to disrespect me. And so essentially that gave me a sense of confidence that, and I figured people were thinking, wow, this guy's got some whats to just stand up with a stutter like that and ask his question anyway.
So they had respect for you.
Right. So I reversed it. Rather than something that's going to make them think less of me, I figured, not that I profess to be a mind reader, because one person might be thinking something different than the next person, so you never know. But I chose to think about it like, man, they must have respect for me. And that really melted my iceberg. So And so by the time I got a physical technique that worked well for me,
Mhm.
which was getting dialed in to my breathing, and also, like you're saying, it might be a little different, but that's stretching out some sounds, a little,
Mhm.
like I'm doing right here, or
Mhm.
starting some words and then pausing, like I'm doing right here, which once again is that resisting time pressure, right?
Mhm.
I'll do this as many times, as I want
Mhm.
to, and
Good
therefore
eye
we're not,
contact.
right? We're not putting that internal time pressure on
Yeah.
ourselves. Just spit it out, Mike, spit it out.
Yeah. 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 That's a nice change to make. Makes you comfortable in the world and comfortable with yourself.
Right. And so once I found that physical technique that worked well for me, it was off to the races. I mean, it was a pretty quick transformation just because
Mhm.
the iceberg was melted. And so I really think, like you're saying, for the vast majority of people, it's more effective to start with the underlying part of the iceberg, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, and it's just kind of the whole thing of trying to make you fluent. If that's the focus, then people feel like failures every time they're not fluent.
Mhm.
And, you
Yeah.
know, that's not good for morale. It's not good for your internal self-talk. Oh, why is the technique working with my therapist, but I walk outside and it falls
Mhm.
apart. There's something wrong with me.
Yeah. I'm not doing something. It's my fault.
Right. And I think that's that learning not to give a what about whether we stutter, and like you said, even embrace it and almost reverse that psychology. So rather than waking up in the morning thinking, oh, I got a big presentation today, I hope I don't stutter, I hope I don't stutter, hope it's a good day, rather than that, how about thinking, yeah, bring it on, bring on the
Yeah.
stutter.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Worst case scenario, I'll stutter a good bit, and it'll be an opportunity for people to, to see that a stutterer can be confident and can be intelligent and can finish their presentation just fine.
Yeah. 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 I like that idea. Bring it on. I mean, it's like you almost look for opportunities to see how you can deal with it. Yeah.
Right. And then you stop trying so hard not to stutter, which
Yeah.
reverses the psychology of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
it's really, it's, I mean, in a lot of ways it's counterintuitive, right? With most things, you want to you know, try to be as good at it as you can. But in this case, the
Mhm.
better you try to be, especially the more fluent, that trying to be perceived as a normal fluent speaker
Mhm.
and caring that other people perceive you that way really makes it tough.
Yeah. I wonder if the same thing happens in sports. I mean, if you're there and there's a big pond between you and the hole, what would happen if you said to yourself, well, I hope this goes into the pond? Would,
Right,
would that would that give you back your confidence, or that, like, it wouldn't be necessarily a conscious thing, but you just stop tensing up as much?
right. I mean, I hear you. That or uh, not that you're actually like going to downsize your club so that you guarantee you hit it in the pond, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, so it's a nuanced, delicate balance almost that we're talking about here, right? Where you try to hit a good shot, yes, um, but you just sort of ex- almost expect the worst, but hope for the best. But
Hmm.
but also put in some effort to hit the best shot you can, but just not to worry about it, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, if
Yeah.
it goes in the pond, it goes in the pond. Whatever.
Maybe you could say to your partner, "I'll give you $1 if I'll give you $1 if I don't go into the pond. Will you give me $1 if I do?" Or something like that. I don't know what it is.
Right.
But
So you
something
win
to
either.
reverse the whole thing.
So you win either way. Yeah, I
Yeah.
hear you.
Yeah.
Uh, so, um, so we're just about near the end of our time here. Um, so, as far as the future of stuttering therapy,
Hmm.
because a lot of it, as I think I mentioned, over the past however many decades, a lot of it, for a lot of us anyway, was sort of the trying to be fluent
Hmm.
and not done in the group setting. Um, well, and would you agree that stuttering to some extent, I mean, forgetting about what caused it originally, because I know there's great controversy about that, to what extent it's genetic, to what extent it's childhood, what happens in childhood, all that kind of stuff. And probably impossible to know for each individual why exactly they became a person that stutters. But but as far as the helping people to struggle less and to live a better life, um, do you think that the future of stuttering help is going to get back? And I believe, well, someone we haven't talked about is Joseph Sheehan. Did you know Joseph Sheehan as well? Or
Yeah. Hmm.
gotcha. And I think he was sort of in the Van Riper model to some extent, right? As far as attacking the fear and going out there and really talking to people and non-avoidance and all that good stuff.
Yes, he was very much that way. I mean, I don't know that he really got into Van Riper's behavior change, but he certainly got into the non-avoidance stuff, like, go ahead and be open about your stutter. And that seemed to be the heart of where he was going.
Mm, gotcha. So do you think that, do you predict for the future that maybe we get back to that approach more, something like what Van Riper was doing with the group therapy and the really getting dialed into avoiding or to the non-avoidance, and, you know, facing the fear, and if you're afraid of it, then
Yeah.
go do it over and over
Yeah.
and over again, and combining that with physical, a physical technique that has been successful with a lot of people as well.
Well, certainly, that's what I would advocate. But it's fascinating. I was talking to someone who is my contemporary and had worked with Van Riper himself, and he's teaching at University of South Carolina, and often, and he's a researcher, but often he'll be consulted about the stuttering. And he said he's surprised about how many, sort of modern ideas. And a lot of these are coming from people who stutter, like through the National Stuttering Association places. Is you don't even need to work on your stuttering, just accept it, and be open about it, and the heck with trying to change. And so, I think like everything else, stuttering therapy, goes through cycles, and more of this for a few years, and then swings back the uh, other way. But I think there's a lot in like now, and even more in the future, about just feeling like you have a total right to stutter, and there's no reason you should try to be fluent. And so that's good. I mean, I think people, are accepting themselves as people who stutter, and you just see a lot of, I know one of the people who took my place at the University of Vermont um, will get all the kids in her groups together, and they'll march from the university down to the Ben and Jerry's store at the bottom of the hill with these big signs saying stuttering rocks and stuttering's great. And then all the cars will honk when they see these kids and walking down like that. And so there's a lot of, pride about stuttering and that kind of stuff. And so that's a good thing. But I think, just from my point of view, I'm hoping we're not giving up on the behavior change. We're not giving up on stuttering in easier ways, because I think that feeling of being able to, I know Sheehan didn't like this word, but being able to control your speech, I think gives you confidence. I mean, I actually like to stutter. I couldn't tell you if that was real or fake, but in any case, I don't mind the little stutters that I am able to do it in a way that is easy and comfortable. I mean, it's like I'd rather have those than be totally fluent. Um, so yeah, so I obviously it's hard to predict the future, but I just hope we don't. I hope the profession doesn't give up on making modifications, as well as feeling like I've got a right to stutter.
Right, and I like where you're at with that in terms of not wanting to be, and that's how I feel also. I mean, now I guess it's certainly easier to say uh, when you're telling the stutter more or less when it's going to happen, rather than it just sort of falling on you at sometimes the most challenging times. It's good to have some certainty over when it's going to come and not going to come, and
Yeah.
how it's going to go when it does.
Yeah,
Right.
and what you can do about it. Listen, this has really been great. I've enjoyed talking with you. I just happened to look at my clock, and I usually meet somebody down the road to walk our dogs together at 4:00. So we probably better wrap up.
Likewise, Barry, it was great talking to you, and was about to wrap it up there, so it's perfect timing. And thanks for talking to me, and thanks for everything that you've done over your long career in the world of stuttering.
Okay, let's stay in touch.
So take care.
Okay.